I'm going to start off kind of talking about the title of this show a little bit and just kind of coming up with some of the framework for it. So this idea of painting as environment is an essay that I wrote in 2017. And in that, I was talking about how this period in the 1960s and 70s, where Rosalind Krauss eventually coins this term, the expanded field in relationship to sculpture, has all of these relationships to painting as well. And in that essay, I started to talk about how I think this works best when distinctions between floor, wall, and gallery space become a site-specific space for painting. And then I have this subheading, May You Live in Interesting Times. This is a title that has been batted around a lot. So playwrights have used this, a number of authors have used this. I think most notably Albert Camus uses this title. It's also the title of the 2019 Venice Biennale, and Ralph Rugoff, when he was curating the show, also attributed this as this kind of common saying, phrase, or potentially ancient Chinese curse. Interesting times being times of war, of famine, of inequality, of poverty. And so what you actually want to live in are boring times. Perhaps most interestingly is in 1936, a member of British Parliament uses this phrase, may you live in interesting times, in relationship to Hitler. And so it also has this political dimension that is kind of foreboding and quite serious. So I've broken up my talk in thinking about this into 4 parts. I'm going to talk about America, Brazil, Japan, and France. And I think these are all interesting times in the way in which it plays out. So we'll start first here with deconstruction. Deconstruction happening here, of course, as this response to all of these notions that somehow painting is now dead. Douglas Crimp, many other artists come along after abstraction has reached this kind of zenith or kind of summit, and then all of a sudden we're in a period of now examining what all of that was. So the discourse of otherness, of difference, and other kinds of modernities are now on the table. I have a little kind of snapshot, a little historical snapshot for each one of these, just to kind of place us back into that period. And I think this notion that painting is dead then kind of leads the opportunity for performance, installation, earthwork, conceptual art. Of course, we have a number of progressive situations taking place on the political and social stage, and then a kind of reversal of some of those progressive elements through a number of assassinations, history that I'm sure we're all familiar with. I think this leads us to a number of artists who then begin thinking about this, of course, in ways that are quite interesting. Alan Shields, among a number of other artists, starts working on a number of surfaces that are non-traditional surfaces in an effort to kind of get away from the structural foundations of painting. We might think of one of those foundations as if a painting is something that is both a support on a stretcher bar, that if we deconstruct that, we're deconstructing the form that might be hierarchical, patriarchal, European, Western kind of notions of what a painting constitutes, breaking that down. So through the form and through its deconstruction, we might be also getting at a kind of radicality. And I think Shields does that when he's looking at things like a paper towel, and then using that as an opportunity for us to think about perhaps a kind of transcendent, joyful kind of experience on a rather throwaway kind of material. This period, of course, is something that doesn't get a lot of traction. It's a blip on the screen. I think in part that's important to think about, right? In that I see this as an intervention, less as a kind of movement or style or trend that takes place, but a kind of period that's segueing us from this period of modernism, right? This period in which flatness, ideas about the picture plane, ideas about the serious mindedness of abstraction are still kind of holding sway. And then this period that pushes us closer to postmodernism through deconstruction. And this show, High Times, Hard Times, in 2006, finally kind of does a survey of all of that work. And obviously there's a number of really wonderful artists in it. Linda Banglis pouring her 40 gallons of pigmented latex here in '69. And this space with which painting now bridges between sculpture, painting, installation occupying perhaps all three. David Hammond's, of course, also merging this space. In that essay that I wrote, I was thinking quite a bit about how participation is a part of the way that we experience painting now as well. And perhaps in this Hammond's piece, there's quite a bit of that, right? There's a nexus that happens between print and performance in a work like this, and then a relationship to identity, inscribing the black male body into the work itself, and then kind of having this relationship, of course, to other artists who think similarly, but yet deconstruct those too, right? Pollock thinking about that kind of movement of the body, and perhaps most famously Klein's works of performance works. But here Hammond's is kind of using that as a foil in many ways to kind of talk about much larger social issues. Can a racialized, othered body somehow then also have a subjectivity that acts as a gesture in space? Some of those prints, resulting prints. I like the ambiguity about that idea, the ambiguity about the space that it holds. Here's Paul McCarthy's performing whipping a window in a wall with paint. So, you know, there are also ironic moments, I think, of this too, where he's got this fabric, he whips the wall, the paint drips down, and so the people on the other side are seeing a performance painting in progress as the paint drips down and becomes onto the floor. Some Elizabeth Murray, who is hard not to love. I think Elizabeth Murray in particular, this space with which she kind of deconstructs the idea that a painting is an object that hangs on a wall in relationship to people in that space, and then becomes an object that then you have to comport yourself to in relationship to it, in relationship to the space of the architecture of the gallery as well, kind of contorting, distorting, shaping a relationship to all of those spaces. And perhaps why Murray gets so overlooked in this period of deconstruction is that it's doing all of the things that previous high modernist painting was not allowed to do. In particular, there's pleasure and there's play involved here. And I think those are also kind of big no-nos that are also part of deconstruction that are so important as a foundation. And yet the same thing happens all over the place. So I have another little infographic thinking about how all of these things might also make its way into thinking about the kind of painting that was happening. So a relationship to colonialism as Algeria gains independence. We also have the first time that women can seek employment without permission. How absurd, 1965. We have a kind of class struggle, a student movement, and then which eventually, of course, ends in a 10 million general strike in '68, which shuts down Paris for a month. This space that happens here and how it relates to painting, I think, is interesting too. These painters are not actually in Paris, who are part of Support Surface. They're actually coming from the south of France. And because of that, they have a different relationship to perhaps that immediacy of all of these kinds of issues, and yet they still kind of embody it. So there's a relationship to post-structuralism, to Marxist theory, to the student movement, but perhaps without the immediate visibility. I think this is incredibly misunderstood and underrepresented modernism that took place that we still don't have a lot of traction for. I think one of the ways that we can also think about this is how these artists were using a variety of materials that were non-traditional. Tarps, tents, paintings that hang onto the floor, paintings that roll up. How can a painting kind of have a kind of non-hierarchical status in relationship to the wall is a big part of this as well. Perhaps by painting's undoing its domestication even, that it might be stripped of all pretense and it might blur art and life. So it's still part of the avant-garde in that way, right? It's still trying to kind of find that middle ground. Sator does these pliage works where he's folding them up and then opening them back up again, not too dissimilar from that show right now at Timothy Taylor that just came down. Claude Violet, of course, who makes these works where he's very much interested in getting away from a certain kind of sensibility of a mark being a marker of subjectivity. I think that's so interesting about that form of abstraction, that it's actually a collectivist idea about abstraction. It's actually like de-authorizing the individual to some degree and becoming more about a mark that anybody can make for the sake of having a kind of larger conversation about the possibilities for abstraction. Perhaps another foil there is, can abstraction even speak to the complexities of modern life whatsoever? And so perhaps in doing all of these non-traditional things, ritual procedures, that perhaps I might be able to talk about what everyday life can actually look like through abstraction. So Daniel Dezou's flexible wooden ladder, wooden paint, these cut canvas works by Louis Kahn. And perhaps, you know, one of the more interesting folks is Noel Dola here as well. You know, where Dola has these drying rack with handkerchiefs, you know, these discardable, throwaway materials that have a relationship to an incredibly domestic situation, and yet also have this relationship to a geometric kind of canvas. And so there's a bit of a kind of a sense of humor, I think, in this work, and a sense of play, and then also a sense that like somehow that thing, that doily, that handkerchief, that thing has now kind of entered into the space of what high painting can be, brought low. As well as these collaged cigarette packages, no doubt a relationship to the grid, a relationship to all of the kinds of ideas circulating in minimalism and post-minimalism, and then also bringing that materiality of the cigarette box in front of that, and kind of making that into something that, again, is kind of a domestic, everyday situation. I think there's something about like also the introduction of like an everyday activity, the handkerchief wiping my mouth, the cigarette that I blow the smoke from, this kind of sense that like it's a lived experience of abstraction. The ladder rolls back up again. All of these ways in which it performs itself, it performs its identity. And then neo-concrete in Brazil. This military dictatorship that's in Brazil in '64, after this coup that takes place with support from who else but the United States of America. And we love sticking our nose where it doesn't belong. And we have this movement, this amazing movement that kind of comes out of it as a result, the Tropicalia movement, which is this explosion of cultural activity in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo as Brazil tightens its grip. And Helio Otísia, who really is kind of perhaps one of the seminal figures of this movement among others like Ligia Clark and Ligia Pepe, kind of are interested in the participation of the viewer and the audience participation. I believe Tropicalia also was a term that was being circulated as like this notion of Brazil or South America as like paradise, where maybe Westerners could kind of come and hang out and relax, but kind of wanting to disrupt that, saying, no, there's actually like a political crisis taking place here, and there's a different kind of relationship that we as Brazilians have to our homeland, and we're trying to assert that through the kind of abstraction that we're up to as well. So I just have a few slides of some of these Otísia works where he, you know, the audience is invited to move through them, kind of moving through them as painting / sculpture with these panes, these colored panes where you see yourself on the inside and the outside of them. I think of these as like the person becoming the painting, somehow activating the painting, activating some idea of the painting / sculpture. And Ligia Pepe's Divider here in '68. You know, this work, I think in particular, has a very, very clear relationship to the protests that are taking place. The participants are invited to peek their head through this large piece of fabric, and then you are now walking in this group, and you've now become a walking painting. Now it's now a walking painting / active protest, walking down the street. As well as Ligia Clark. You know, Clark is interested in this notion that art is more like a body than a discrete object. And this radical idea led a lot of artists to kind of get toward neo-concrete. And her bichos, these sculptures here, this installation in 1965, all of these sculptures constructed out of metal planes allow the authors or the authorship of the audience to enter. So the audience is allowed to reposition these things, and these possible configurations can take on multiple iterations. And as a part of that, it's like destabilizing the notion of the painting or the sculpture as an autonomous, complete object, but now needs to be completed by the audience to some degree. And then famously Gutai, where I have another little infographic where we have the ANPO protests that break out in Japan because, yet again, you know who is doing stuff. And we have this revolutionary fervor in the 60s that takes place at the National Diet Building. There are students who are involved in a student movement barricading themselves inside universities. And Gutai forms, of course, in relationship to all of this, these radical ideas that are about to happen, kind of preempt this to some degree in the 50s. And I think also this idea about individualism being a central concern, right? Under imperial Japan, this kind of totalitarian regime that promotes the idea of a national body as opposed to individual expression, no doubt is at the center of a lot of these artists' thinking, as is this relationship to performance. They have almost a kind of interesting reading of action painting, almost an interesting misreading of Harold Rosenberg and of Jackson Pollock, thinking about like somehow action means my body doing the action, and so I now can become a mark. So in this Murakami work, he's set up the works and is now jumping through, passing through the work itself and performing the painting. And this Shimato, you know, forgive me if I'm pronouncing these names wrong, making this painting by hurling glass bottles against the canvas. It's unfortunate that these kinds of things are almost co-opted by TikTok stars doing silly activities on social media. And then perhaps the most well-known figure of this being Shiraga, who says, and I have a quote here, "I want to paint as though rushing around a battlefield, exerting myself to collapse from exhaustion." So there's this kind of relationship to perhaps a heightened awareness of the body, a heightened awareness of one's presence and need to act in the world, lowering himself with this rope onto the floor where the canvas is now spread with paint and allowing his feet to make all of these marks. Incredibly physical works. I think the Guggenheim did a survey of a number of this work not too long ago, somewhere in the 2010s. And so where does that kind of bring us today? Just to kind of bring us up into the modern day, because that's supposed to really be the topic of my talk. I don't see this as a style or as a trend. I think I see this actually as a part intervention that happens in different periods. And just maybe circling back around to this idea of may you live in interesting times, we are definitely living in some very interesting times yet again. Climate change, civil unrest, polarization, the rise of far-right populism, a number of issues that have brought us to a moment in which the possibilities for painting or perhaps any of the visual arts to act in relationship to a larger kind of social and political world feel at threat, perhaps even marginalized. And I think some of the ways in which some contemporary artists are thinking about that might kind of point out the ways that they've been historically, and then also reanimate these kinds of concerns that were happening some 60 years ago. So here's Rashid Johnson's The Hikers, where in this installation he set up a dance performance, a musical performance, and then also had the paintings on view, perhaps something that can never quite be replicated again. I think something that's interesting about that is like perhaps the transient nature of that somehow you have to be here in this space, animating it with me in order for us to kind of have this relationship to it. A larger kind of shot of some of those works in that show, this Broken Five, which I believe is a reference to the 5 falsely accused young boys in Central Park, who Donald Trump, of course, really tried to make a case against. Ceramic, mirrored glass, spray paint, wood, brass, oil stick, and black soap and wax in these works as well. Vivian Suter, the Argentinian painter who will let her paintings sit outside and collect rainwater, dust, snow, all kinds of reactions to the surfaces. And then this relationship between the climate and herself as artist create these conditions for trying to think about how the environment and climate change how an artist can be responsive to the environment and climate change. And then, of course, her installation, I think, is such a radical kind of way of thinking about painting. It's lying on the floor, it's in a clothing rack, it's hanging in a salon style. I threw Katharina Gross in here because I believe she's also kind of thinking in these terms as well. Creating something that's somewhere between a painting, sculpture, wall, installation, and perhaps encourages something that feels jubilant, exuberant, almost kind of psychedelic in some of these works. This installation that she did at Rockaway in 2016, perhaps a desire to kind of reclaim a space or take a space in a new direction. Kelty Ferris, Kelty's work I think this is a really interesting example of the way that an artist can then also look back toward the past and reanimate that same desire. Kelty is a transgender man and is using his body coated with paint, making an impression, and perhaps there's now questions about what kind of body this is that's being represented, that he's asking himself of both himself and an audience. Mary Heilman's installation here, I thought about that domestication in those French paintings, about using the handkerchief, about using a cigarette carton. And here we have the domestic yet again. We have chairs, we have tables, and we have paintings that are kind of on a diminutive scale, that are on like a kind of very human, playful-like scale, that now are kind of in tandem with one another. Cheryl Donegan, a conceptual painter here in New York City. And these relationships between fashion, wearable art, painting, this is territory that I think a number of artists from the avant-garde, from that first iteration, were also thinking about, maybe Sonia Delaunay, among other artists, thinking about this kind of like painting that can be lived through, lived with, in a way that destabilizes its sense as separate from the other kinds of arts, textile, fashion, so on and so forth. I think here too, in this kind of work, the desire for pleasure also comes back up again. I think that's also like one of those areas of the avant-garde that's deeply, deeply overlooked, and also still not quite seen as legitimate in relationship to other parts of the avant-garde. Just kind of thinking back in terms of the way in which that first iteration, we think about Rodchenko and in the Russian avant-garde. We think about some of the early expressionists in the German avant-garde. We think about some of the ways in which those moments through Dada and Surrealism used a certain kind of political edge, and that's kind of the shorthand, perhaps, for being able to have legitimacy around the avant-garde, that blurring of those things into life. And yet those same avant-gardes still had play within them. We might think of Jean Arp cutting up fabric, laying them through chance operations, and then creating abstractions based on that. I think there's something to Cheryl's thinking about repetition, printing, serialization, and then those things kind of creating these moments that are both pattern, that resemble abstract painting, resemble banners, resemble clothing, that somehow blurs all of them. It's like both all of them and yet none of them all at the same time. I don't think that all of these artists that I'm talking about in this kind of moment, in this expanded painting moment, all occupy this same territory as being perhaps expanded painters, quote. But I think that what they do is that they flirt to different, they flirt with these ideas to different degrees. I think Amy Silman is one of them, somebody who makes both conventional paintings on stretchers and then also will make paintings that almost take on a kind of serial narrative-like dimension, something that almost feels filmic as well, from a beginning, middle, end, with this figure that pops up again and again through these iterations, hanging them with these clips as if it's like a clothesline. There's this relationship to the kind of, again, the destabilization of the autonomous object, and now it's like a painting that's also film slash cartoon slash narrative of painting. I think this is a kind of interesting way of revisiting some of these ideas that were present in some of those other ideas as well. Laura does something similar here. We might think of Laura Owens as somebody who almost kind of does a kitchen sink idea about painting, where she's using bicycle wheels, all kinds of texture, printing methods in relationship to the painting. But I think this relationship to iteration and to serialization is something that happens as a way to kind of deconstruct the way that we see the work itself. I have to move around this wall in order to see all of it, or I have to back up this far in order to understand the work itself. And then what is the relationship to the gesture here? Perhaps the gesture here is now in a fraught kind of place. I don't see the gesture as having the same kind of authority, perhaps that abstract expressionism would have claimed, but perhaps a kind of destabilized gesture that's about something that continues from one to the next in different kinds of provisional ways that it shows up again. Perhaps a way of saying that the me that is present is something that kind of transforms slightly over time. My subjectivity somehow being spread out over time over all of these panels, that it's not this singular place that holds all of my authentic expression of mark making. And then some Peter Halley. I think this might be my last slide in here. Thinking about the way in which Peter's project started off talking about the cell and the conduit and abstraction, and has now kind of gone on to talk about a number of ways of thinking about both expressive acts and geometric acts with these wall installations that he's been creating. Most recently had a show where he had a certain kind of lighting in the gallery, a kind of very terrible, garish, yellowish lighting, and then the works themselves hanging on the wall against one of these painted backdrops. And the entire thing, again, became like a site-specific space of painting, where the wall, space, and paintings are now animated in a way that kind of gets at some of these ideas. I think Peter in particular is interested in garishness as a way of provocation, a way of trying to kind of eschew ideas about taste and our comfort and comfortability around abstraction as a nice thing that kind of decorates a contemporary apartment wall, but actually kind of wants to kind of push its audience into a place in which that discomfort is actually seen as a virtue. So just to kind of wrap up, I think these ideas that happen in expanded painting are ideas that allow us to kind of think about the ways in which abstraction can actually have agency or social or political kind of economy in relationship to the larger world around us. I think there's a number of works that are happening today that are actually about social and political ends. We have a lot of works that are happening around ideas about identity and representation and visibility. And I think some of these artists actually point to the ways in which painting that is abstract or painting that becomes involved in deconstruction actually performs some of those same notions, but perhaps through a way or a means that actually expands them, deconstructs them, allows us to probably have questions about the position of one's identity in relationship to an object to begin with. So, thank you. So, we'll take some time for some Q&A. Yes?
Curiosity question. The yellow in both of those paintings is so powerful. Yes.
In these, yeah.
What would you say why? The artist, why? What? I'm thinking his thought process or hers.
Yeah. Well, Peter, yeah, I mean, yeah, Peter Halley. Yeah, Peter is, well, Peter, you know, started off in the late 70s, 80s, thinking about the cell and the conduit and trying to think about abstraction through that lens. He felt as though abstraction was no longer neutral territory, particularly geometry, right? And that's his whole gambit, is that if previous generations of abstract painters could claim that geometry was either the space of the sacred or the humanistic, that for Peter, it's actually the space of all of these authoritative spaces. I go from a big rectangle that is the bank to a big rectangle that is the schoolhouse to a big rectangle that is a prison. And these are all about commerce and interconnection through technology. And he sees that as like a dystopian place, thinking about the panopticon through Foucault. So he's thinking about these spaces as actually not humanistic, anti-human, and then trying to make paintings that respond to that, geometry that might respond to that. And so I think his color palette is actually about that. Even though that these aren't like the cell and the prison in these, I think there's still this sensibility of like, this is a confining sense of geometry. That color works, and it also kind of doesn't work. It's so garish pop candy that it's saccharine and also like repulsive. And I think that's an interesting space that he's trying to kind of noodle around and provoke geometry. Whether or not it's effective or not, I think is totally up for debate. And there's plenty of people who really dislike Peter's work, but I think that's where Peter has been headed for a long time. Yeah.
Speaking of the panopticon, this I feel as if every square knows it's being observed.
Yeah, there is something a bit about that. And he's using that kind of stucco on them too, to create these textures in different places. So there's something very kind of totally depersonal about them. You know, there's not a sense of his humanity, his touch, his sensibility in the painting. There's a total removal of that. So there's something about that too that feels as though it's about a denial of the human, or the human being compromised, perhaps. It's a very negative way of thinking about abstraction, but I think it was a way of trying to think about its possibilities after postmodernism.
And the background is his as well?
Yeah, I think it's based on an explosion. I think it's, I can't remember the exact explosion that it is, but he's repeated it as a kind of pop explosion that happens.
Contrast too, because it's sort of organic.
Mm-hmm.
It's design, right?
Yeah.
Compared to the very geometric of the paintings, I think really pushes both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Quick comment and then a question. I appreciate how you framed this. Well, I'm very aware in this and always thinking about this, the way that othered bodies are visible in this work in a different way than through this kind of deconstruction or violation of the sort of hierarchical rectangle of modernism, that suddenly the presence of women and other, they're not white males, become really visible
Right.
in these actions. That feels really palpable in this to me, and appreciate that. And then a question that perhaps outside of the parameters of this talk, but I wonder how you might place arte povera in relationship to these questions.
Yeah.
It seems like, another arm or something of those same conversations.
Yeah, I felt like I couldn't stretch myself too thin, but you're totally right. You're totally right. Arte povera could have fit in here. I mean, just given the fact that this is about reclaiming a space, I thought this is a talk where I'm trying to kind of talk about all these other modernities that are overlooked modernities. We still have, we have exhibits of these. People are very familiar with them, but we don't have the same familiarity that we do with the narratives about abstract expressionism, minimalism, and conceptual art. We know all of those. We have museums fully dedicated to them, and I exactly that. The idea that there are now racialized bodies, women's bodies, female presenting bodies, and so on and so forth, are now a part of this conversation. No doubt there's also this element too of like America being like, we finally have center stage. The Europeans don't, the exiles came over from the war, and now we've inherited this idea of what modern art is, and we have enough money to kind of promote it as part of a Cold War strategy about individualism and freedom of expression and autonomy that perhaps other cultures don't. And we totally ignore what's going on in Italy and Brazil and Japan and France. Yeah.
Speaking of the France sub-theme, I was watching some older lectures about the history of abstraction recently, just to brush out. And it was very American focused and was from the former moment period and whatnot. But there's some of that I made a connection with during your lecture, and it was the handkerchief work. And in that lecture, the speaker brought up this relationship between an Ellsworth Kelly rubbing at Mondrian painting of, dealing with the grit, and he started talking about how the drawing that Kelly had made was in fact directly appropriated from some tile work in Paris where he was living at the time, and started talking about this kind of like intermingling, kind of like diffusion of kind of avant-garde painting ideas and painting visuals into kind of more everyday objects and spaces, and then how that kind of then moves back into art through people who were inspired by those objects. So he was drawing, and then I couldn't help but think about that conversation in relationship to this piece, where the handkerchiefs could just as easily be Mondrian paintings. That's part of the point that this artist is making.
Oh, that's really fascinating. What was the name of that?
It was a series of lectures by Kirk Varnadu from like 2003, like really old, but about just the kind of discussion. But like the conversation around that diffusion of these kind of more niche aesthetics into more banal or everyday objects and visual cues is pretty interesting in relation to this work.
Yeah, no, I'll have to check that out. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just pick up on something just slightly as an aside, but I thought it was very interesting. Is I suppose the mystique of all of this. You're referring to it in some ways in the way that America sort of constructed itself after World War II is to place itself at the head of what was going on in modern art. But I also then juxtapositioning that with just a throwaway comment that you made on TikTok. And this idea of, is it that I, which is discussed among artists, is sort of the demystifying of painting and the demystifying of what's involved, and actually looking at a lot of the artists that you've used here in terms of either the motifs, the materials, the setting, the subject matter, and in some ways is that maybe responsible for the fact, is people arguing that they don't engage with it anymore, or painting to the same extent because of this demystifying or not? I just find it interesting that there's a lot of deconstructing going on, and then I'm wondering who's going to be responsible for constructing, if I dare say, in a positive way. Does that make sense?
Interesting. Yeah, this space in which like painting still maintains some sort of aura or something that somehow is metaphysical, spiritual, somehow beyond us. Yeah, I think a number of these artists are kind of no doubt responding to some of that previous moment, particularly this historical moment in which that kind of ab-ex desire for tragedy, doom, ecstasy, these big emotional, transcendent kinds of sublime feelings are now about like, well, perhaps we actually need to focus on like our material lives in order to talk about like what it is to be. And through that, abstraction will actually now be made finally accessible to all, because there'll no longer be a barrier toward a language or a way of thinking about painting that you need to be inducted into. I think they're both interesting pulls that happen. That kind of, and that pendulum swings back and forth all the time. There's a fair amount, I'm sure Dannielle will talk about on the panel later today, the amount of spiritual kind of transcendent abstraction that's kind of taking place. So these ways in which crisis either elicits a response of like total deconstruction, desire for revolution and some sort of reorganization of society, or a kind of desire for a kind of spiritual humanism that might bring us into a larger, much more compassionate, empathetic, understanding society, right? But they're not mutually exclusive, but they can take these different paths. And I think what's interesting is the way in which a number of these artists seem to take a very kind of strong materialist path.
Yes.
Some of these ones that are working today, like when I got to this period of talking about painting now, and Lygia Clark is kind of a mystic, so she's an outlier in here, but but the way in which like some of these kind of occupy a middle ground. Like I think there is something a bit, there's something quite humanistic and social in this, right? Where it's like she's painting with fish scales on these paintings. Like, so she's really trying to get away from like the idea that like the brush is gonna make the mark. And then there's this like sense of like, I'm letting nature take over the painting, and it's not this precious object anymore. It's gonna kind of be a bit decrepit by the time it gets into the gallery. And that, yet they're so beautiful. You know, they're so like aesthetically kind of like, you get this warm kind of sense of presence and touch from them. And I'm like, oh, that's an interesting middle space between perhaps different ways of thinking about the social and the political.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Jonathan.
Thanks for that great talk, Jason. Can I ask how you found your way into this topic of the expanded field of painting?
Yeah, I've made painting installations myself. And in a 2018 show, I did a show called The Gate. And in that show, I painted this gate pattern on the walls and then hung the paintings on the wall. And the paintings themselves had a number of like gate, lattice, fence, architectural relationships. And I thought about how the gate could be a metaphor for, well, it's a structure that occupies so much of New York City, and it's a boundary marker for like the way that you can access or not access other parts of the city. And then it's also this kind of like, it's not the grid, it's kind of like a 180 idea of the grid, and then it might kind of make the space into something that I felt was kind of like almost accordion-like. So I kind of believe in the possibilities for painting to kind of engage with these like expanded painting notion ideas, and I know you have as well, kind of straddled this territory. And I think it's a space that a number of painters think about as a way of kind of like thinking beyond just their own conventions in an effort to propose something else. And I feel like I see it in a number of shows that are both representational and abstract. My only criticism is when it starts to become like wall decoration. Then I feel like it's doing something that is actually not very interesting on an aesthetic or conceptual level. And there are moments of painters kind of engaging with it at that level. Like when I think about the way that like a Target store creates like bookend panels for like oranges or whatever, right? Then I'm like, this is kind of an expanded grocery store moment, in that you're not just setting up like things for people to buy, you're setting up like the display. It might come off onto the floor, there might be like a banner on the wall. Like you're thinking spatially in respect to an object. And that's like a very commercial idea of that. And so I'm critical of it when it starts to do things like that. Like there's a number of spaces that I think are just like spectacle versions of an expanded painting idea. Like that work that's at the MoMA right now, I can't recall the artist's name, the swirling AI work. What's that artist's name? Just totally drawing a blank. I think that's a great example of like spectacle expanded painting idea, where something becomes about like a kind of fetish novelty object and then becomes about like wowing the audience, taking me into a kind of like space of like wonder and magic that like Disneyland does. And I'm like, that's totally the opposite of what painting should be doing if it wants to be taken seriously. And so when it starts to kind of merge into that space, then I actually have quite a bit of criticism for it. Yeah.
But if somebody like MoMA has the space, is giving that space to that work, then straight away then it's being recognized and will be recognized and will be part of discussions for decades to come. I mean, the same thing can be not accused, I shouldn't use that word, but somebody like David Hockney, for example, and these big digital spectacles that he was doing that were in London, and some people have seen literally as spectacles rather than actually being works of art.
Yeah.
Now, but again, you can either discuss either side of that and say that it is the language and materials of today, that this is what people are responding to, this is what they're familiar with, the big digital screens, the big film, no more than if they were walking into a 13th century cathedral in the past. So it is interesting. I take your point actually, but the point is that MoMA's already sanctioned it.
Yeah. Well, and museums and galleries have opportunities to to then create these conversations. And then we have, I think, as a viewing public, a kind of responsibility to then question whether or not that thing that was done and is now part of that permanent collection or so on and so forth is legitimate. I mean, I think we need to kind of have this responsibility to institutional power as not somehow a kind of end-all be-all of legitimacy. And I think in that case, I think that's a really great case for something that elicits a conversation, but then does it hold up over time as a conversation that will generate critique and discussion around it remains to be seen.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel that way about other artists who also engage with spectacle. There are works from artists like Jeff Koons where I'm like, that's kind of interesting. And then there are works where I'm like, that's pure spectacle and involves us in a discussion that is incredibly banal. Like The Sphere in Las Vegas. Like, it's like, some of that work is basically touching on that kind of space. And it's like, ugh, cringe. Yes.
I just want to say something in response to your idea of expanded painting. I think the idea is very interesting, the distinction between different types. But the other thing is also interesting is that painting is actually a very minimalist medium. So sometimes just a painting can totally engage the space without going outside of the rectangle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the most interesting things about painting.
Yeah. Well, and a number of these artists still maintain a relationship to convention, too. And perhaps it's a conversation about when it's being used and to what ends. Yeah, but I take your point.
Minimal, like, what is the minimal gesture you need to have
Mm-hmm.
engagement?
Right, right. Anyone else?
That's more a comment than
Yeah.
a question, really, but I'm just interested in what Angela's just said about the TikTok trap. But it's almost what sort of seemed to happen in France with the Surface group.
Mhm.
Someone like Viala, I feel like it's kind of that anti-Warhol in the sense that actually he was taking something that was quite high art, that form of his that he's always repeating,
Mm-hmm.
that's become known as the beam in
Mhm.
France.
Mm-hmm.
It's not elegant, but actually was literally supposed to be the back, a woman's back, and
Oh, I didn't know that.
abstracted form of a woman's back, so kind of quite high art, and
Uh-huh.
then has been, because he repeated it so much, it became his brand.
Yeah.
It's actually become,
Mm.
as I say, it's now designated as a beam.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Considered something kind of quite mundane.
Yeah.
But also the slight trap of what happened in France post-68 was that sense that, you know, this idea that they threw out sort of painting as being a bourgeois construct, you know, piece
Right.
of painting.
Sure.
And deconstructed in that way, supposedly to get rid of that sort of bourgeois conceit, and yet actually put in its place something that, contrary to what they were aiming to do, became way more elitist.
Yeah,
Yes,
right.
it's actually accessible to.
And I think this is the critique of the avant-garde in general, right? Is like the way in which the avant-garde then becomes a new kind of convention, a new kind of academic space that we sanction and say we're going to put into history books, and we're going to say this is now the thing that future generations need to contend with and respond to, and yet is trying to kind of break around that. I mean, I think those are also part of the failures, quote unquote, because I'm not always sure if they're absolute failures, but this desire to kind of get around the marketplace that the avant-garde has. How do you make an object that is not simply bought and sold and then trafficked through an art world and kind of creating more and more objects for a wealthy class, but actually kind of somehow subverts that space altogether? We might say that like that part of the avant-garde didn't succeed. that ascendant wing of capitalism kind of taking the market and running with it is the one that won out. So it does beg the question about like to what end? And I think that's also my critique of spectacle, is like, okay, like to what end does it both kind of have the aspirations for social and political relationships to an art public, and to what end does it simply pander to it or say, hey, that's not my gambit and it's not something that I'm not interested in somehow trying to engage with. I'm going to actually kind of give the masses what they want, and what they want is entertainment. And I can go there with them to some degree. And I think there are some artists who, to some degree, there's a bit of conceit there. There's a bit of like complicity or acknowledgement of that as a condition, and not a battle for them to have any relationship to whatsoever. I think what these artists, or what these modernities pointed at, and I think is still a relevant takeaway for us, is that like material is never neutral, and that like painting is also never neutral. It's always within a context that is social and political. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be Diego Rivera making socialist murals, but what is your position? Like there has to be a position. The position can't be, I am in love with neoliberal capitalism and everything's hunky-dory. That's a position. That's not neutrality. That's a certain kind of acceptance of a certain kind of condition that I think probably most of us as artists contend with to some degree, and want our works to be bought and sold. And yet, what are the other kinds of implications that surround that kind of thing is a discussion that I think these modernities elicited.
But just to finish the point, I think that for me, I've always, the more I look back to, we discussed earlier, Monet's Orangerie, the more I find that incredibly ahead of its time and subversive in the way he was actually using really traditional painting to create an infinity loop that was completely immersive in that way.
So ahead of its time.
Yeah. That's painting.
Truly.
Yeah. Literally forces you to walk through it and live it.
Right.
In an immersive way.
Yes. Maybe one. Are we getting probably close to time? So maybe one last one. Yes.
Okay. Well, I was just thinking about people get knowingly or unknowingly like at least 10,000 images across their eyes now. Morrison wrote really beautifully about the idea of visual pollution. In the place of writing in a memoir in 22 years. So I was thinking about the context of, when you're at Gladstone Gallery, you're going to gallery itself and all that economic power and all of its history and its advertising sets up a frame.
Yeah.
So.
No, that's a good point. I mean, when we think about perhaps, especially the first avant-garde, there was a lot of opportunities for them to show outside of the gallery context, and that was a big part of it. And all of these artists are very much in a gallery context, very commercial context. What is the space? What is the space of that? Is there a space for that in the way that existed even some 40 years ago? I think I would venture to say no. The exit arts of the world are a dying breed. But the visual pollution, that's I think a really great term and way to think about the way in which we kind of consume images. And that's kind of what I think a lot of social media and internet culture in general kind of like allows us to do, is to kind of like own it, consume it, eat it kind of as an image. And yet expanded painting kind of disrupts the capacity to perhaps own the thing, because there's a participatory element of it. You have to kind of be there. There's an embodiment. There's a phenomenological thing that's taking place. It's combining a number of avenues for its seeing it as somehow separate from just an image in an image world. Well, thank you so much.